I'm Geri Chavis, a professor of English and Women's Studies at St. Catherine University, and I'm also a poetry therapist and psychologist. I've just published a book called Poetry and Story Therapy: The Healing Power of Creative Expression. It's mostly for people in helping professions, whether they're mental health professionals or medical personnel or creative writing facilitators or people who are working in the prisons, educators. So a whole lot of different helpers who want to try out a way of working that involves creativity and spontaneity, and they'd like to learn about how to use poems and stories and creative writing to help people. I've also found, since the book has been out, that people who simply want to develop their own writing and want to do it for self-esteem and for self-awareness are picking up this book and finding it useful. Poetry is really special, and when I talk about poetry, I'm talking about short lyric poems. And almost always you have a very personal voice of a poet that seems to be speaking to you. And I have seen this over and over again, where people have said to me, I just read a poem that says exactly what I've been feeling for years, but never put quite like that. But there it is. I've had that experience myself. Poets find a way, because they're not working with a lot of words, they find a way to combine words in a way that's new, that's fresh. And sometimes they do it with metaphors. And I have an illustration here with a poem that I've used quite a bit in helping people. It's called Snowbound. And it has really ordinary words, but they put in a very powerful way. There's a time to stop traveling on other people's subways, to halt airplanes from landing in your life, a time to refuel yourself, a time to be snowbound within your own private space, where the only number you dial is your own. This is a poem that gets people thinking about their lives and how they're maybe always doing things for other people, or they're always responding to outside stimuli and not having time to reflect. So I think this is a good example how poetry will just get to the heart of the matter very quickly. There's also in poetry the fact that it's a cousin to music, and there's the sound effects that are there. There's the repetitions that are there. And sometimes you can be lulled into a pattern, and then the pattern is broken, and you wake up and you're alive to something new, to a surprise. Poetry is also very sensory. It tends to give you words that appeal to all of your senses, including the visceral sense. Actually, something I've been doing recently when I work with people, and I talk about it in my book, is physically enacting a poem, like taking the images that are in the poem and feeling them in your body. And I will do this with group participants who are pretty comfortable with the process and with each other, before I would ask them to actually get up and enact a poem. But I think poems are really very physical, potentially. And when we enact them with our bodies, we really get to feel what that poem is telling us. Poetry and story therapy are effective in really a whole lot of scenarios. But on a personal level, I have found that poetry is particularly evocative and helpful in the grieving process, in working with all sorts of issues of loss. And there's lots of different types of losses. The most obvious would be when we lose a person close to us. I have a lot of poems in my files on grief, but there's one in particular I'd like to share with you to illustrate the power of poetry. The name of this poem is called The Thing Is by Ellen Bass. To love life, to love it even when you have no stomach for it, and everything you've held dear crumbles like burnt paper in your hands, your throat filled with the silt of it. When grief sits with you, its tropical heat thickening the air, heavy as water, more fit for gills than lungs. When grief weights you like your own flesh, only more of it, an obesity of grief. You think, how can a body withstand this? Then you hold life like a face between your palms, a plain face, no charming smile, no violet eyes. And you say, yes, I will take you. I will love you again. The important thing for me as a poetry therapist is that there's hope in this poem. Not only does it tap into and match the grief that a person feels, but it has that piece of hope that in spite of everything, you take that face, which is like life, in your hands. And even though it's not a beautiful face, not traditionally beautiful, it's not perfect, but you're choosing life. We are the only ones who can tell our stories in the way that we remember them, the way they happen to us. And when we get a chance to tell our story and then to write it out, we have the chance to reshape it, to reorganize it in some way, to find the meaning of, let's say, a past incident or traumatic incident. And when we have an opportunity to write it out and to share it with other people, and this is really an important part of the process, the sharing. And when people listen to our stories and respond to them, we really feel that we are being counted. And that raises self-esteem. It really helps to support us. One example is a client who had a traumatic background, and she talks about her brother who was very ill when she was a child. She had an older brother, and this really formed her childhood. Her parents weren't very responsive emotionally, and so she brought the troubled background into the therapy and found that she told that story over and over of being neglected by her parents, of living with this child who had kind of a scary disease for her as the younger sibling. And when she started to tell it and had an opportunity to write it out, she began to realize that during this very sad childhood, she in fact had supportive teachers along the way. She had some recollections of her mother that in fact were positive. Even her father, who was very critical, she was able to see sometimes when he honored her intellect. So she actually was able to reframe what she saw as a totally negative childhood into one that was mixed. Another aspect of this is I asked her to write the ideal story of her childhood. And she was very willing to do that. And as she wrote, I could see that she looked happier. She looked calmer, and because she now had control over the new story that she was going to write. Now, she knew it was a fiction. You obviously can't redo your past. But the idea, and that's when she realized, I have been rewriting my story. Like, I'm dealing with people, I have relationships with people who are supportive rather than critical of me, and I've actually been bringing in my ideal story into my daily life. I think the main thing I'd like people to take away is that poems and stories and their own writing of poetry and story can lead to growth in their lives, increased self-awareness, can help healing from pain.